Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. Today I'll be talking about Volta charging. Volta was founded in 2010 and they're the operator of networked EV charging stations. They only operate about 2,800 stations globally, which isn't a lot compared to other companies like ChargePoint and Tesla, which each operate tens of thousands of stations globally. At the moment, Volta has an interim CEO, being Vince Cubbage, but he's the second interim CEO in a row for Volta, the previous one being Brant Hastings. This all came after the founder and previous CEO of Volta, Scott Mercer, unexpectedly stepped down from his position earlier this year. It could be that Scott Mercer just needed a break, but the apparent difficulty that Volta has had in finding a new CEO has made a lot of people concerned about what this could mean for the company. The majority of Volta stations are level 2, but they also have some DC fast charge stations in their mix. Their stations are located in the front of parking lots, and they have these large displays on them that allow them to run advertisements for other companies. In almost all cases, Volta owns their station. They control what ads run on the displays, and as we'll discuss later in the video, control the price of charging at the station. Volta will usually lease or license the land that the stations are installed on. In some cases, the station is sold to the site host, and Volta is not the owner of it, but this is very rare. Even in those cases, Volta is still in control of the advertisements that run on the screen. Volta plans to begin charging customers to charge around this time this year. They're going to start this rollout with their DC fast charging stations, and level 2 stations will be retrofit next year. This means that Volta intends to convert all of their charging stations over to paid stations over the next year or two. Volta will be the one who sets prices, and they also plan to include idle fees for customers who leave their vehicle sitting in the parking spot for a certain amount of time after a full charge. Having customers pay for charging will eventually give Volta two significant streams of revenue for each station, those being the sale of advertisements, as they do today, and the sale of electricity. That revenue is very useful for Volta because their stations are very costly to build. The cost of manufacturing and installing one level 2 station is around $50,000, and it's almost $100,000 for a DC fast charging station, according to Volta. Alongside that big investment, Volta also receives the highest revenue per station in the entire charging market. The displays on the stations usually run advertisements 24/7. The price of those advertisements is based on the number of impressions. Those impressions are calculated by another company called Geopath, a third-party auditor. An impression is counted for every person that walks past the station, not for every person that charges at them. So most of those people are simply people walking through the parking lot and passing by the station on their way into the store. The price usually ranges from $10 to $22 per 1,000 impressions. Price is derived from the volume of stalls and the advertising demand. More targeted ads cost more to run. In 2021, Volta's revenue per stall was just over $13,000. During their most recent earnings call, Volta laid out a plan that they believe can increase their revenue per stall over the next couple of years. The first of these factors being the ability to sell more screen time, the second being the potential of selling advertisements at a higher CPM, and the third being a higher credibility with a larger geographical reach. They believe that national coverage can be reached at around 10,000 screens, and that having that broader reach will improve sell-through and CPM. It's important to keep in mind that that number was 10,000 screens, not stations. So that would be around 5,000 stations, because each station has 2 screens. And remember, they already have about 2,800 stations. With those 3 leverage factors, Volta believes they'll be able to reach a revenue per stall of $23,000 per year, 77% higher than where it's at today. Volta also discussed some statistics about returning customers. These stats I'm about to give are going to sound kind of weird, but I'm just quoting exactly what Volta said, being that in the past 5 quarters, 16 of the top 20 customers purchased ads across multiple quarters. 7 bought in all 5 quarters, and in quarter 1 of 2022, 5 of the top 6 grew spending with Volta by triple digits. And that's exactly what they said during their earnings call. Volta says that their plan to begin charging customers to charge will initially bring in a modest amount of revenue in the second half of 2022, but it'll provide a more significant amount in 2023. When fully mature, Volta expects their charging to charge model to bring in $2,000 to $3,500 per year for every level 2 station, and $10,000 to $12,000 for every DC fast charging stall per year. If we add these charging revenue numbers to Volta's mature ad revenue per stall of $23,000, Volta would come out with about $25.75 thousand per level 2 station annually, and $34,000 per DC fast charging station annually. Using those figures alongside the manufacturing and installation cost, we see that a level 2 station would break even after about 2 years, and a DC fast charging station after about 3 years. Only time will tell what the long-term lifespan of Volta stations will be, but Volta is listing their useful life as 5 to 10 years in the item 1 notes on their most recent 10Q. It's important to understand that these numbers rely on Volta delivering on their plans and are pretty much a best case scenario. Volta designs their stations themselves, but outsources the manufacturing. Peerless AV accounted for 53% of the supply-related expenditures in 2021. I'd like to point out that that number is not station deliveries, but is particularly expenditures. Tianjin BYD accounted for 10% of supply expenditures, and no single other supplier accounted for greater than 10% of supply-related expenditures in 2021. At one point, Peerless AV accounted for 80% of the expenditures. That was in 2020, and as most recently reported in Q1 this year, Peerless AV accounted for 56.5%. Tianjin BYD appears to have slid under that 10% threshold and is not recognized on their list anymore. As of Q1 this year, no other supplier is accounting for greater than 10% of their supply expenditures. Volta also offers a software as a service called Predict EV. They anticipate that this will become their highest margin product, and using their own software, they'll be able to boost the business at their stations. Volta also licenses their Predict EV software out to other companies. Taking a look at Volta's Q1 2022 balance sheet, we can see that they have cash and cash equivalents of $205 million. Their current assets are at $235 million, operating lease right of use is at $88 million, and property and equipment is at $125 million. This brings their total assets up to $449 million. They have $95 million of current liabilities and $198 million of total liabilities. Next up, we're going to talk about the income statement, but before we get into that, I'm going to talk about the revenue. Volta's advertising accounted for 80% of the revenue. Network development accounted for 16% of the revenue. This includes providing site development, installation, operating, and maintenance services, and that rare sale of Volta charging stations to site hosts. Charging network operations accounted for 2% of the revenue. Right now, this pretty much only includes regulatory credit sales. In the future, that's also going to include those charging to charge fees. Finally, their network intelligence category accounted for another 2% of their 2021 revenue. This is their Predict EV software as a service. Volta also gave out some information about their revenue seasonality, stating that in 2021, 15% of the revenue came from Q1, 21% came from Q2, 26% came from Q3, and 38% came from Q4. They also laid out their expectations for 2022, which was that 10% would come from Q1, 20% from Q2, 30% from Q3, and 40% from Q4. They say that the seasonality is comparable to other advertisement companies. Now, taking a look at their income statement, we can see that their total revenue for Q1 was $8.4 million. Their total costs and expenditures was $70 million, their operating loss was $62 million, and their net loss came out to be $48 million. That was helped out by a decline in warrant liabilities. Comparing those numbers over time, we can see that the revenue has grown 77% year over year, their total costs and expenditures have grown 2.7% year over year, and their operating loss has grown 2.9% year over year. So that's most of the information I wanted to talk about today. I'd like to just briefly give my thoughts about Volta and EV charging. I think Volta is making a great effort to get these stations out, and I hope they do end up finding a new CEO. The current situation with these interim CEOs is fairly concerning to me, but I hope they're able to figure everything out. Something that kind of jumped out to me was the selling general and administrative line on their income statement. It was $56 million for Q1 this year, and that number just seems very high compared to everything else on their income statement. If anyone watching the video right now knows anything about that, please feel free to drop a comment down below. If you're into EV charging companies, I encourage you to check out my previous video on ChargePoint. In the future, I plan to make more videos on Volta, other EV charging companies, and many other companies as well. So make sure you subscribe to StockProbe to see those future videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.